The bride in the trunk had given up hope. Then the lid rose. The trunk was wedged up against the left wheel of the overturned wagon, and I almost rode past it. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe the horse did. Calhoun had a way of reading things I'd already decided to ignore. He'd halt mid-stride and just stand there, ears cocked sideways like he was waiting for me to catch up to what he already knew. He stopped. I sat in the saddle a few seconds longer than I needed to, looking at the wreck. Tongue of the wagon snapped clean, both front wheels in the air, 2 of the 3 mules dead in their traces and the third one gone. The driver's box empty. Whoever had been holding those reins wasn't around to explain anything. The wreck wasn't new. The dust had settled back down over the spill of goods, a few crates, a sack of something that had split open and scattered across the grass, a wooden box with a hinged lid hanging loose. The mules had been dead long enough that the flies had organized themselves. 2, maybe 3 hours. The sun was past noon and swinging toward the west, and the light was getting that flat afternoon quality that makes you squint. I stood still in the saddle and looked at it. The wreck told a story, as most wrecks do if you know how to read them. The team had bolted, not just spooked. A spook makes a mess and stops. A bolt makes a wreck like this, the kind where the wagon goes over with real momentum behind it. The tongue had snapped on impact rather than in the run, which meant the team had been going fast enough that hitting the ground stopped the wagon while the mules kept going. One trace had been cut clean rather than broken, which meant someone had still been thinking clearly in the immediate aftermath, and had done what you do: cut the trace to keep from losing the one surviving animal to a dead one. Rudd, probably. Even a man like Rudd would have the presence to cut a trace. Then he'd gone. On the third mule or on foot, either way, gone and moving fast, not stopping to check what was in the trunk or why it was warm. That told me something about Rudd, and the something it told me wasn't good. A man who runs that fast from a wreck in open country is either scared or guilty or both, and neither possibility made him a character I wanted to meet today. The trunk was army surplus, iron-banded, the kind you could lock a man inside if you had a mind to, and it had been locked. Someone had thrown a padlock through the hasp, not a big lock, the kind you use on a gear room door, but it was there. I got down off Calhoun and walked to it. I wasn't looking for a person. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe just an explanation, some reason the wreck had happened and the driver had run. People run for a lot of reasons out here, and most of them are bad ones. I put my hand on the lid and felt something I hadn't expected: warmth. The wood had been in the sun, sure, but not just that. There was heat coming from inside the thing, the faint kind, the kind a living body gives off. I put my ear to it. Breathing, shallow and slow and scared. I looked around me. The flats ran out in every direction, yellow grass, a line of cottonwoods half a mile east where a creek would be, a sky that told me nothing. Whatever had happened here, the people who'd made it happen were gone. I went back to Calhoun and got my rifle from the boot, not because I expected trouble but because I'd stopped expecting nothing. I set the rifle against the trunk. Then I bent and looked at the padlock. It was a Miller 4-lever, old. The keyhole was on the right side, which told me the key was somewhere with whoever had run. I stood back up and did the arithmetic. The woman inside, because I already knew it was a woman, the breathing had told me that, something in the rhythm of it. The woman inside had been in that box since before the wagon went over. Maybe hours. The sun was past noon. If the wreck had happened in the morning, she'd been in there most of the day. I went back to Calhoun and pulled the short-handled hatchet from my saddlebag. The padlock hasp was iron, but the wood around the hinge wasn't any better than ordinary pine. 3 swings took the hinge screws out of the frame. The padlock went with the hasp, swinging free, and I lifted the lid. She was on her side in a wedding dress. Not a fancy one, not the kind women in cities wear with all the lace and the long trains. This was a simple dress, white gone to cream, with small buttons up the back and a collar that had been fresh that morning and was now sweat-damp and pressed into the side of her neck. Her hands were bound at the wrist with a strip of rawhide. Her eyes were shut. Her lips were moving just slightly, and I realized she'd given up talking to whoever was outside a long time ago and had turned inward, wherever people go when they stop believing the lid's going to rise. Her hair had mostly come down from whatever arrangement it had started in. One dark strand was pasted to her cheek by the sweat. I said, "You're all right." Her eyes came open. She looked at me the way people look when they've been expecting one thing and the world hands them another. Not relief exactly, not yet. Something more careful than that, more used up. She said, "Are you with him?" It wasn't a question, it was a test. "No," I said, "I'm not with anybody, I'm just passing." She held my eye for a long second. Then she lifted her bound hands toward me. I cut the rawhide with my belt knife. She pushed herself upright in the trunk, and I watched her work through the business of sitting up in a wedding dress after God knows how long on her side in a box. She was deliberate about it, not dramatic, the way a person gets when they've been afraid for so long that even relief doesn't get to be loud. She pressed the backs of her hands together, working the feeling back into them. Then she put one foot on the lip of the trunk, and I offered my hand without thinking much about it, and she took it and stepped out onto the grass. She stood still for a moment with her eyes closed, just breathing the open air. Then she looked at me again and said, "Who are you?" "Holt," I said, "Cal Holt." She looked at Calhoun, then at my rifle leaning against the trunk. "You're a lawman." "Was," I said. I don't know what she read in that. She didn't ask. She just turned and looked out at the flats the way you look when you're deciding something, when the inside of your head is running faster than your face is willing to show. Her name was Nora Voss, and the short version of her story was this. She'd been on her way to a wedding she hadn't agreed to, arranged by her father with a man named Greaves who owned most of the water rights on the North Range, and a third of the town of Calderon besides. The man who'd driven the wagon was Greaves's hired hand, a Scotsman named Rudd who'd drunk through most of his goodness years ago. She'd refused to get out of the box the night before, barricaded herself in with her traveling case, and Rudd had simply locked her in and driven on. She hadn't seen daylight since the previous evening. I asked what had happened to Rudd. She said she didn't know. She'd heard the mules bolt and then the crash and then nothing. Then silence, then the sound of my hatchet. I looked at the two dead mules and the wreck of the wagon and tried to piece together what might have made a team bolt that hard. Rattlesnake, maybe. Rider crossing too fast, too close. A gun going off. There wasn't a way to know. I asked if there was somewhere she needed to go. If there was family, somewhere safe. She was quiet for a few seconds. She looked at her hands, still showing the lines where the rawhide had been. "My father's in Calderon," she said. "He's the one who arranged it." "All right," I said. "Anywhere else?" She said no. I stood there a minute thinking about that. A woman in a wedding dress in the middle of nowhere with nowhere to go. The nearest town that wasn't Calderon was Rays Creek, which was 2 hours' ride southeast. After that, the next settlement was a mining camp that I didn't think much of as a destination. "I'm heading to Rays Creek," I said. She looked at Calhoun again, then at me. "I'm in a wedding dress," she said. "I know. I have a traveling case in the wagon." She turned and looked at the wreck. The case had slid out when the wagon went over and was lying in the grass, partly covered by a piece of oilcloth that had come loose from the wagon bed. She went to it without asking, found the latch, opened it, pulled out a folded blue dress and a pair of sensible boots and set them in the grass beside the case. She checked the rest of the contents with quick, efficient hands, replacing a few items, removing one small bundle that she tucked into the front pocket of the case without explaining. She glanced back at me. "I need a minute," she said. "Sure," I said, and walked Calhoun a respectable distance away and stood with my back to her. The sun was working on my shoulders. The flies were still at their work on the mules. Somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a meadowlark was going through its repertoire with no particular sense of occasion. That was the first time I noticed something that took me a while to name. There was no performance in her. She wasn't making anything easier or harder than it was. The situation was what it was, and she was moving through it with the same deliberateness she'd used getting out of the trunk, not helpless, not showy, just doing what came next. In my experience, that's either the quality of someone who's been through enough that drama costs more than it pays, or the quality of someone who is going to be all right in their life one way or another. I suspected both. She said all right. I turned around. She'd changed into the blue dress and traded the white slippers for the boots. The wedding dress was folded on top of the open traveling case. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the case. She left the dress on top of it in the grass and didn't look back at it. The ride to Rays Creek was 2 hours on Calhoun with the two of us aboard, which meant it would be 3 or more. She walked alongside the horse the first stretch. I offered twice, and she declined twice, and I let it go. After about an hour she accepted the offer, not because she was tired, but because the boots had been sitting in the case since spring and they needed some accommodation. She rode behind me with her hands resting on the sides of the saddle rather than around my waist, keeping a deliberate distance, which was the sensible arrangement given that we were strangers. The first hour she didn't say much, and I didn't push. The country out here teaches you things if you stay in it long enough, and one of the things it teaches you is that silence between people isn't always empty. Sometimes it's the most honest thing in the air. At some point she asked how I came to be in that part of the flats. I told her I was heading west, that I'd had a job in Dunmore and it was finished, and I wasn't in any hurry to take on another. What kind of job? Deputy, temporary, election dispute. She thought about that. What kind of dispute? The kind where both sides believe they won, and one of them is right, and one of them will pay somebody like me to make sure the other one stays wrong quietly. She looked at me sideways from behind my right shoulder. I could feel it. Which side hired you? The right one, I said. This time. She seemed to find something in that worth keeping. She rode another 30 yards before she said, "You don't sound like a man who believes that most of the time." I looked ahead at the trail. "No," I said, "I don't." She nodded, just once, like I'd confirmed something she'd already decided. We rode on. At some point she started talking and I realized she'd decided to trust me, or at least decided that trust was the only card she had left and she might as well play it. She talked about Calderon, about her father's ranch and the drought that had come 3 years running and the debt that had come with it, and how Greaves had made his interest known the same autumn the creek dropped below the water line for the first time in living memory. About how she'd said no and her father had said he understood, and then 6 months later the arrangements were already made. About how she'd argued and then pleaded and then stopped doing either when she realized that none of it was being heard in any room where decisions were made. She wasn't bitter telling it. She was plain about it, laid it out like a survey, like she was giving me the facts of a piece of ground so I could read it correctly. She told me about Greaves, how he had a face that looked honest enough if you saw him at church on Sunday, which was where most people saw him. How he kept that face at church and in the bank, and in the main street conversations that get reported to the rest of the county through the ordinary gossip that passes as news. How the other face, the one that had decided she was a commodity and not a person, only came out in private rooms. How she'd seen that face exactly twice. Once when he visited the ranch to speak to her father and she'd been listening from the hallway, and once when he'd come to speak to her directly, a week after she'd found out about the arrangement. That second meeting was the one she described in detail. She'd been in the parlor. He'd come in and sat down and looked at her the way you look at something you've purchased but haven't yet collected, Told her it was going to be a good arrangement. Told her he'd built something worth coming into and she ought to count herself fortunate. Used the word fortunate twice. What did you say? I asked. I said I hadn't agreed to anything. What did he say? He said that didn't much matter. The trail curved around a low rise and straightened again. Calhoun's rhythm didn't change under us. She told me about the box, how she decided the night before the departure that she wasn't going to leave the trunk voluntarily, how she told Rudd and how Rudd had laughed, which was the response of a man who either didn't believe her or had already planned for the possibility, how she'd gone into the trunk with her case and pulled the lid down and held it from inside through the night, and in the morning she'd heard Rudd tell another man she was being difficult, and the other man had said lock it, and so it was locked. She told all of this in the same level tone she'd used for everything else. Not performing the bravery of it, just stating what had happened. I had been a lawman for 25 years and I had a pretty full catalog of the things people do to each other in this world, and this one still sat badly with me. Not the worst thing I'd encountered by a considerable distance, but badly enough. I said, how long were you in there before the wreck? Since before first light, I don't know exactly, a long time. A long time. In a locked trunk in the summer heat. I thought about that arithmetic for a while and then stopped thinking about it because there wasn't any useful end to it. She said I heard coyotes at some point, before it got light. That was the strangest part. Why strange? Because it was one of the only sounds I recognized. Everything in there sounded wrong, the wood, the wheels, the way sounds were cut off at the edge of the trunk. Even my own breathing sounded like someone else's, but the coyotes just sounded like coyotes. A pause. That was a comfort, I don't know why. I thought about that. Because it meant the world was still out there, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, exactly that. We were on the creek now, the cottonwoods running alongside us on the left, the sound of water below the cut bank. The shadows were lengthening. We had maybe an hour of good light left. I said, your father, how did he end up in debt to Greaves? She was quiet long enough that I thought she'd decided not to answer. Then she said, 3 years without rain. You understand what that means out here? I do. The first year you go into your reserves and you tell yourself it'll turn around. The second year you start borrowing against next year's expectation. The third year, she stopped. The third year you're out of room. Her father had run cattle on a decent-sized spread north of Calderon for 20 years, she said. Not a rich man, but a solid one. Had more years of good than bad and had put enough aside that he felt secure in the way you feel secure when the last bad stretch is far enough behind you that you can't quite remember the taste of it. Then the creek ran low, then lower. Then the summer came on hard and the grass went yellow by June, and the cattle started losing condition, and there were decisions to make that were all bad ones, sell now and lose money, hold on and maybe lose more, pull the herd to grazing you'd have to pay for which ate what savings you had left. He held on too long, she said. That was the thing he did wrong, the decision he made that was understandable and wrong at the same time, which is the hardest kind of wrong because you can see your way to it clearly even after the fact. Greaves had come in the second year, when things were bad but not yet impossible. He'd come with an offer on the water rights, not the land, just the water, and her father had said no. The third year, he'd come again. Her father had said no again, but it was a different kind of no, the kind that knows it might not hold. And then, I said. And then my father went to the bank in Calderon, she said. The bank where Greaves has 2 seats on the board. I nodded. I understood how that kind of machinery worked. The loan came with conditions, she said. Not explicit ones, nothing written, but conditions. Greaves made his interest plain. After the loan was signed, yes, came to dinner, was very charming, very clear about what he thought the future looked like. She paused, And my father sat there at the head of his own table and didn't say anything to contradict him. There was no bitterness in it telling this. There never was with her. She was plain about it, which was its own kind of harder, maybe, than bitterness. Bitterness gives you somewhere to put the thing. Plain accuracy just makes you carry it as it is. I said, he thought he was doing right by you. I know he did, she said. That's what made it so difficult to be angry at him for very long. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a scared one. She looked at the trail ahead. Scared men do things that cruel men couldn't improve on. I thought about that for a while. She said, what happened to you? How do you mean? You said you were a lawman, that it was past tense. Something happened. I didn't answer right away. She said, you don't have to. I know, I said. I'm just thinking about how to put it. You could put it plain. A year that went wrong in several directions at once, I said. That's the short version. And you've been riding west since. Not exactly west, just moving. She considered that. How long? 7 months, more or less. Do you know what you're looking for? I thought about the question honestly. No, I said. Do you know what you're moving away from? That was a different question, and a better one. Not anymore, I said. She was quiet behind me for a while. Then she said, that's further along than you might think. I glanced back at her. She wasn't smiling exactly, but she wasn't not smiling. I want to be honest with you about who I was when I rode into that stretch of flats that afternoon. I was 54 years old and I had been a working lawman for most of 25 years, in 5 territories and 3 states, and I had been good at it. Not in the way that gets a man famous. I didn't have that quality, the theatrical quality, the kind of thing that makes the dime novels. I was good at it the way a good carpenter is good at his work. Thorough, patient, not wasteful of motion. I solved problems methodically. I kept the peace in places the peace preferred to be somewhere else. I brought men in alive when I could and did what had to be done when I couldn't, and I slept most nights. I'd been a good deputy before I was a sheriff, and a better-than-average sheriff for the 12 years I held the job. I'd had 1 serious friendship and 1 serious romance, in that order, and lost them both to the work in different ways. The friendship to distance and time, and the way you drift when you're always moving and the other man isn't. The romance to a specific night in Harlow that I won't try to explain except to say that it ended something I hadn't understood was already fragile. By the time I lost the sheriff's job, there was an election, as there often is, and elections in that county went the way they went, which was usually toward money. I had a horse, a bedroll, a rifle, a reputation in several counties, and very little else. Some savings. A few names of people who'd give me work. I went back to deputy work, temporary arrangements. The election dispute in Dunmore was the 3rd such job in 8 months. And then there was a year that went wrong in several directions at once, and at the end of it I was none of the above. I don't want to make it into something larger than it was. It wasn't any one event. It was a string of them, close enough together that I didn't get time between one and the next to set myself right. The shooting in Blackwater was the first of them. It was a justified shooting. I want to be clear about that, and the inquiry was clear about it too, and I've never second-guessed the mechanics of it. But there was a quality to that particular aftermath that I hadn't encountered in quite the same way before. The man I'd shot had 2 sons, both under 10, and one of them was there. He was behind the door when it happened and came out afterward and stood looking at what was on the ground, and then he looked up at me. He didn't say anything. He was too young for the words, maybe. He just looked. I thought about that look for a long time afterward. I still think about it sometimes. That's not guilt exactly. The shooting was right, but rightness and its aftermath don't always match up. I hadn't understood that as clearly before. Then there was the woman in Harlow. Her name was Delia, and she was a teacher, the kind of teacher who makes you wonder why you stopped enjoying thinking about things. We'd been seeing each other for several months, on and off. I was in and out of that town on various jobs, and she was the kind of patient that comes from having reasonable expectations of a man who works the way I work. She met someone else while I was on the trail. A settled man. A man with a house. She wrote me a letter that was honest and fair, and which I read 3 times and then burned, not out of feeling but out of the practical need to not carry it. The burning was the part I thought about afterward more than the letter. What it said about me that the most efficient response to loss was to make it not exist as an object. And then there was the business in Ord County. I won't put a full description to it. 3 men. I was right about 2 of them, wrong about the third. Not catastrophically wrong. The outcome was still what it needed to be, and the 2 I was right about are still alive and have had occasion to regret that on several subsequent occasions. But the third one's wife asked me a question afterward, standing in the door of her house with a child on her hip, and another one visible somewhere behind her in the shadows of the room. And the question was simple and quiet, and I haven't found an answer to it that I'm satisfied with. None of those things alone would have done it. Together they added up to a certain kind of tired that sleeping doesn't fix. The kind where you get on your horse in the morning and ride because riding is what you know how to do. But the thing that used to make the riding mean something has gone somewhere and you can't locate it. That's who I was. Not broken. I want to be clear about that. I could still function in any situation you put me in. I could read a room and ride a trail and read a man's intention in his shoulders before he moved. The skills were all there. The equipment was all there. I just wasn't sure anymore what it was for. And that quality, that uncertainty, that absence of a center, was the condition I was carrying when I rode into those flats and almost didn't stop for a trunk that a horse wiser than I was decided we ought to look at. We reached Ray's Creek an hour before dark. It's not much of a town, a main street, a feed store, a saloon that did more business than anything else, Vera Kindle's boarding house at the south end, a church that was being rebuilt after a fire the previous winter, a small school that had 3 students at the moment and had once had 12. The kind of town that's hanging on and knows it and keeps hanging on anyway, because the alternative to hanging on is stopping, and stopping is dying, and there are enough people there who aren't ready for that. Vera Kindle was in her 60s, wide-shouldered, with hands that told you she'd done more physical work in her life than most men twice her size. She'd been running the boarding house for 15 years, since her husband died and left her the building and a modest debt, and the necessity of deciding what to do next. What she'd done next had turned out to be exactly the right thing. The house was clean and well kept, and she fed you honestly and charged you a fair price, and didn't get in your business unless your business got in hers. She looked at Nora with the fast, accurate assessment that women of that generation had. You could watch it happen, that reading all in a second, and said, "Come in out of the air. I've got a room on the 2nd floor." She looked at me. "Cal Holt," she said, "didn't expect to see you again." "Vera, you look like something dragged you backward." "It's been a stretch," I said. "Come eat something." So that was the first night. Vera fed us at the kitchen table, beans and salt pork and cornbread that she'd made that afternoon, the kind of food that costs you nothing to make and is somehow what you need most when the world has been rough. Nora ate steadily and without pretense, the way a person eats when they're genuinely hungry and past caring what it looks like. I watched Vera watch her and could see the older woman revising upward her estimate of the girl with each passing minute. Vera had a quality I'd always appreciated. She didn't push you to explain yourself. She provided what you needed and let you get to the explaining in your own time or not at all. She'd seen enough of the world's business come through her kitchen that she'd stopped needing to know all the details of each piece of it. After supper, Vera showed Nora to her room. I heard them talking upstairs for a while, not the words, just the low cadence of 2 women working through an arrangement. Then Vera came back down. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me and sat down across the table. "What's her situation?" she said. I told her the short version. Vera listened without interrupting. When I was done, she sat for a moment with her cup in both hands. Outside the kitchen window the night had come on full, and the one lamp on the table was the light we had. "Greaves," she said. "You know him." "Enough. He had a man in here looking for a woman 2 weeks back. Didn't say what for. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching the description." She looked at me. "Because I hadn't, now I have." "He'll probably send someone else." "Probably." She didn't sound particularly troubled by it. Vera had a specific quality of steadiness that I'd always found reassuring, the kind that comes from having faced down a number of things over the years and found you were still standing at the end of them. "Can she stay here a while?" "She's got some money in her traveling case. Not a lot." "I'm not asking about money," Vera said. "I'm asking if she's safe to have around. Is there going to be trouble?" I thought about Greaves. What I knew of him was mostly what you picked up in the way news travels out here, part rumor, part ledger entry, part the shape of a man's reputation as it shows up in the way other people hold themselves when his name comes up. He owned water. That made him powerful. Power like that doesn't like to be embarrassed, and a woman walking away from a locked trunk was an embarrassment. "Possibly," I said. Vera nodded. "All right." She stood and took her cup to the basin. "You're in the end room, you know where it is." I said I did. "Get some sleep," she said. "You look like you've been riding on empty." I went up to the end room. It was the same room I'd had 3 or 4 times before, same iron bed, same washstand, same window that looked out over the south end of the street and the dark shape of the creek line beyond. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while with my boots still on. I wasn't thinking about Greaves. I wasn't thinking about the road ahead or what I was going to do in the morning or any of the practical things a man in my position ought to be thinking about. I was thinking about breathing in a dark box, about the specific courage required to keep breathing steadily when you don't know if anyone's going to come. I put that thought away and lay down, and was asleep in 5 minutes. I should have ridden on the next morning. I knew it when I woke up. The sensible thing, the thing I would have done a year before, 5 years before, was to get on Calhoun and point him somewhere useful and keep moving. My business in Rays Creek was done. I'd brought the woman to a safe place. Vera was the safest person in 3 counties as far as I was concerned. There was nothing else that required me here. I got up. I washed my face and hands in the basin. I dressed. I put my boots on and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them. Then I went down and had coffee and sat at Vera's kitchen table while the morning came in through the east window, and I did not send for my horse. Nora came down an hour after I did, in a dark dress that wasn't the blue one from the day before, something from the case, something practical. She had her hair up and properly done, which meant she'd slept and had the luxury of caring about small things again. She poured her own coffee from the pot on the stove without asking and sat down across from me. "Are you going?" she said. "I was thinking about it," I said. She held her cup in both hands. She looked out the east window at the same light I'd been looking at. "There'll be a man here by noon," she said. "Rudd probably didn't make it far on foot. He'll have found a horse somewhere and gone back to Greaves." "Most likely. Greaves will send someone." "He will." She looked at me. "I'm not asking you to stay." "I know. I want to be clear about that." "You are," I said. We sat for a moment. "But," she said, "but I'm still thinking about it." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, something behind a smile. She said, "You're a careful man." "Too careful sometimes," I said. "Not careful enough others." She thought about that. "Is this one of the ones you'll regret being too careful?" I looked at her. She was watching me the way she'd watched me the day before on the flats, not challenging, not asking for anything, just reading. Like she was genuinely curious about the answer and had nothing riding on what it turned out to be. I said, probably. She nodded just slightly, like she'd expected that. Then stay, she said. At least through noon, see what arrives. What arrived at noon was not one man but two, and they weren't subtle about it. I watched them come up the main street from Vera's front window. Two men on fresh horses, riding together, the kind of easy paired movement that says they've done this kind of work before, and know each other's habits well enough that they don't need to talk through it. The one on the left was taller, wearing a gray duster, with a hat pushed back the way men push hats when they've been riding in heat and have stopped caring about the look of it. The one on the right was broader, younger, with a rifle in a saddle boot that he touched every 30 seconds the way some men do when they're keeping themselves coiled for a thing they expect to need. I'd seen men like this before, plenty of them, competent most likely. Professionals, in the way that men who hire their experience out can be called professionals. Not the worst I'd dealt with, not the easiest either. I went to Vera and said, stay in the kitchen with her. Vera said, I've handled Greaves's men before. I know, stay in the kitchen anyway. Vera looked at me for a moment with that particular look she had, the one that sized you up and decided whether you'd earned the concession. It was a look I'd been on the receiving end of maybe 4 times in the years I'd known her, and each time she decided differently. This time she said, 15 minutes, then I handle it my way. That's all I need, I said. I went outside. I stood on the porch with my hands easy at my sides and waited for them to pull up. They did, about 10 feet from the step, and the gray duster one looked me over with the practiced efficiency of a man reading a problem he's done the math on before. We're looking for a woman, he said. Traveling case came through yesterday, probably with a man. Lots of women travel through here, I said. This one was on her way to a wedding. He said it flat, no humor in it. Was, I said. He looked at me steadily. You want to be careful, friend. I'm not your friend, I said, and I'm done being careful. She's not getting back in that trunk. The one on the right stiffened slightly. That was useful to know. He had a temper under the professionalism, and temper is useful to know about. The gray duster one held very still. He was doing the math. I could see him doing it. Counting what he knew against what he didn't, running through the possibilities. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I said. I've been dealing with men who work for water rights and land claims and other men's money my whole working life. You're not the worst I've seen, and you're not the scariest. I looked at him with the directness that had settled into me sometime in the years after Blackwater, the quality of looking at something and not flinching and not posturing either, just looking. I'm Cal Holt. I was the law in Blackwater, Dunmore, Harlow, and Ord County. Look those names up, if any of them are worth looking up to you. The right one wasn't stiffening anymore. He was recalculating. The names meant something to him, or the way I said them did. The gray duster one kept looking at me. His hand hadn't moved toward anything, and I gave him credit for that. He was a professional. He was running the numbers. He would know, as professionals know, that the porch was the wrong ground, that I was already placed, and they were in the middle of an open street, that the math had shifted since they'd ridden in. He said, Greaves won't let this go. Greaves is welcome to come speak to me personally, I said. You tell him Cal Holt said that. You tell him I'll be here and the woman stays, and that's the lay of the land. I let that sit one beat. Unless he wants to try the law route, in which case he can explain to a judge why a woman was locked in a trunk against her will, and being delivered to a man she didn't agree to marry. The gray duster one looked at his partner. The partner looked back at him. What passed between them was the kind of communication that doesn't need words, the look of two men who have just both had the same thought and are checking to confirm it. The gray duster one looked at me one more time, and I saw him make the decision. Not retreat, a postponement. The kind of postponement professionals make when the math shifts and they need to go back to their employer before they spend the coin. "This isn't done," he said. "Didn't say it was," I said. They turned their horses and rode back up the street. I watched them go until they were past the feed store and still going. Then a little farther, until the dust they'd raised was thinning on the air behind them. I stood on the porch a moment longer, just breathing. Then the door opened behind me and Nora came out and stood beside me. She must have watched from the window. She didn't say anything right away. Neither did I. Down the street, a man who'd been watching from the doorway of the feed store went back inside. A woman with a basket on her arm, who'd stopped walking when the two men rode in, started walking again. The town resumed itself with the particular ease of a place that's seen this kind of thing before and knows it passes. After a while she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. They'll come back. They might. Or Greaves comes himself." "He might." I looked at the street. The last of their dust was gone. If he does, it gets harder for him. Right now it's a woman who escaped an uncomfortable arrangement which is awkward but not actionable. If he keeps pressing, it's a woman who was locked in a trunk against her will and delivered against her consent, which is something a judge can look at. The longer he presses, the worse his position gets. I paused. He's a man who owns things. Men who own things usually know their arithmetic well enough to know when a line of pursuit is costing more than it can return. She was quiet a moment. "You think he'll leave it?" "I think he'll weigh it," I said, "and then we'll know what kind of man he is." She looked at the empty street. "You said your business here was done." "I thought it was," I said. She didn't say anything to that. She just stood there beside me looking at the empty street, at the settling dust, at the ordinary business of the town resuming itself now that the moment had passed. I stayed 3 more days. I want to tell you I had a good reason, a tactical reason. The men might come back. Greaves might appear. There was an unresolved situation and I was the one best positioned to handle it. All of that was true and all of it was a version of the real reason, which was something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet and maybe wouldn't be for a while longer. The real reason was simpler and harder. I had not felt necessary to anyone in a very long time, and standing on Vera Kindle's porch and watching those two men recalculate their intentions, I'd felt it again. The thing that used to make the writing mean something. Not from the confrontation itself. I'd had 1,000 confrontations and most of them didn't mean anything at all. They were just work, things that needed to be gotten through. This one was different because there was someone behind me in the house who the confrontation was about. I was standing between her and something she needed standing between. That's a different thing entirely from just doing your job. On the first of those 3 days, Nora sat in Vera's front room and wrote 3 letters. She wouldn't tell me what was in them, but she asked Vera for envelopes and sent a boy to the postal office. And after that, she had the particular steadiness of a person who has made several decisions at once and committed to all of them. There's a quality to that kind of steadiness that's different from ordinary calm. It's quieter, more directed, like a stream that's found its channel. I spent that day putting some small things right around Vera's property. The porch step that had been soft for a while. I'd noticed it the night before and said something to Vera about it, and she'd said she'd been meaning to get to it. I got to it. Then the hinge on the barn door that was pulling out of the frame. Then a section of fence line near the creek that had gone loose over the winter and had been meaning to go looser ever since. Vera watched me do it from a distance for a while and then stopped watching and let me get on with it. There's a particular satisfaction in small repairs that I've never been able to fully explain. Maybe it's that they're finite. The step is soft or it isn't. The hinge holds or it doesn't. After years of the kind of work I did, where the problems were always human and therefore never fully solved, there was something good about a problem you could resolve completely. Drive the right nail in the right place and the thing works. That's all. In the evening, the 3 of us ate together again. It was a quieter meal than the first night, more comfortable. The kind of ease that settles in when people have shared some hours and stopped having to think about how to present themselves. Nora asked Vera how she'd come to Ray's Creek. Vera told her briefly, without drama, husband's idea, his death, the decision. Nora listened with that active quality she had, the filing and organizing and building of a picture. Then she asked one or two questions that showed she'd been listening accurately. After we were done, Nora helped clear the table without being asked. I noticed that, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was the kind of thing that tells you something about how a person moves through the world. On the second day, Nora asked if she could ride. I said she could have Calhoun if she didn't mind a big horse. She said she didn't mind. We rode north of town along the creek, which still had water in it unlike most of the country around, a narrow, steady stream, running quiet in its banks, with the cottonwoods throwing long shade across it. She rode well, as I'd suspected from the way she'd managed the trail ride. No excess, no showing off, just a natural ease that spoke of a childhood on horseback. We rode side by side where the trail was wide enough and in single file where it wasn't. The morning was cool and the light was good, the kind of morning that makes the country look like it's trying harder than usual. We didn't talk much the first hour. I'd noticed she was comfortable with that, with riding without filling every silence. And I thought about how rare that was, how most people treated silence between two people as something that needed to be corrected. At some point she asked me about Calhoun, how long I'd had him, where he'd come from. I told her. Bought him off a man in Colorado who was giving up ranching and going to work in a copper mine and didn't want to take the horse into that life. The man had been fond of the horse and had wanted to sell to someone who'd treat him well, and he'd asked me a number of questions before agreeing to the price, which I'd respected. That had been 6 years back. She asked what it was he did, the thing I'd noticed about reading what I'd decided to ignore. It's not easy to explain, I said. He does it on trails sometimes and in town sometimes. Wherever there's something that wants looking at and I've already decided not to, he stops, waits. It used to irritate me. Now I just follow his lead. She looked at the horse. Has he been wrong? I thought about that. Not so far, I said. She nodded as though that confirmed something. We went on. At some point she stopped on a rise and looked back south at the town. My father's going to send someone too, she said. Probably. I wrote to him, told him I was safe and that I wasn't coming back to Calderon, not to the arrangement. She paused. He won't like it. No. He might agree with Greaves that I don't have much choice. I thought about that. What does the law say? The law in Calderon says what Greaves wants it to say, she said, which isn't unusual. She looked at me. Is it unusual? No, I said. She nodded. She'd already known the answer. She was just checking whether I'd be honest about it. We rode back to town in the long light of the afternoon. At some point the trail narrowed and she rode a length behind me, and I found myself thinking about the things I was noticing without intending to. The way she held her shoulders, easy but not soft. The way she looked at country, not admiring it exactly, reading it, the way someone looks who has learned to understand what terrain tells you about what's ahead. The particular quality her face had when she was thinking, which was often a stillness that wasn't blankness. You could see the work happening behind it. There was a stretch where the creek crossed the trail at a flat ford, and we walked the horses through it, the water cold around their fetlocks. She looked downstream where the creek made a bend and then straightened. There were days when I'd ride out from the ranch, she said, just to be somewhere my father's worry wasn't. She was looking at the water. Out here you can see everything coming. Nothing can get close without you knowing. That's why people settle next to creeks, I said. Water and visibility both. Yes, she said, but that's not why I liked it. She looked at me. I liked it because out here, whatever's coming is actually coming. It's not hiding in the next room pretending everything's fine. That evening after supper, I sat on Vera's back step for a while. I was thinking about a thing Nora had said on the ride almost offhand. We'd passed a stretch where the creek ran over flat limestone and the water sheeted across it in a thin, bright curtain, and she'd said, without looking at me, "I used to think this country was harsh. When I was young." A pause, looking at the water. "Now I think it's just honest." I sat with that on Vera's step for a good while. The lamp was on inside, and I could hear Vera and Nora talking through the kitchen window. Not the words, just the sound of it. The unhurried back and forth of two people who'd found they had more in common than they'd expected. The night was clear and the stars were sharp. A dog somewhere on the south end of town was making its opinions known about something that had passed too close to its territory. From the creek, frogs. I thought about Vera's look from that morning, the assessing look followed by the decision. I thought about Nora saying, "Whatever's coming is actually coming. It's not hiding in the next room pretending everything's fine." I thought about a year of not quite being present, of riding and working and doing what was in front of me, and somewhere behind all of it, a part of me that had been waiting for something without knowing what. I didn't have a name for what the last few days had started. I wasn't going to try to name it yet. But I could feel it there, the same way you feel the change in the air before rain. Not the rain itself, just the knowing it's coming. There was a conversation I keep thinking about from that second evening. Vera had gone to bed early. She kept ranch hours, up before light and down not long after dark. And Nora and I were at the kitchen table with the lamp and what was left of the coffee, which had gone cold an hour before, and neither of us had mentioned it. She asked me about the names I'd given to those two men. Not the counties, the specific history attached to them, what had happened in each place in brief. Not because she wanted to know the catalog of it, she was too sensible for that, but because she said, "I want to understand what you were offering them, what you were telling them you were." I thought about how to answer that. I said, "In this work, your name is a kind of currency. Not your reputation, that's a different thing and more inflated. Your name is what you've actually done and the record of it. When I gave them those counties, I was giving them something to check, something verifiable. The story of what happened in those places is a matter of record in most of them." She said, "And what does the record say?" "That I did the job," I said. "Each time. That men I brought charges against were guilty. That men I brought in alive stayed alive. That the ones I had to shoot had a reason to be shot." She was quiet for a moment. "And the record doesn't say anything else," she said. It was neither a question nor a statement. It was the thing itself. "No," I said. "The record doesn't say anything else. The record is correct on the facts." She looked at her cold coffee. But the facts are the outside of it," I said. "The record is what you can see. It doesn't say anything about the boy behind the door. It doesn't say anything about what the wife asked me." She was quiet for a long time. The lamp made a small sound, the wick settling. "Do you think good work can leave marks?" she said, "even when it's done right?" I thought about that. "Yes," I said. "And you think that's a problem?" "I thought it was," I said. "Now I think it might just be the cost of taking it seriously. The cost of caring whether it's right, not just whether it's done." She looked at me. "Men who don't care whether it's right don't get the marks." "No," I said, "they get something else." She turned that over for a moment. "I think that's probably true," she said, "about most things." We sat with the cold coffee and the lamp for a while longer. At some point she said she was going to turn in, and she went upstairs, and I sat a little while more before I went up myself. But it was a different kind of sitting than the sitting I'd been doing for 8 months. Less like waiting and more like resting. Less like a man who doesn't know where he's going and more like one who's stopped somewhere real. On the third day, a letter came back for her. She read it at the kitchen table with Vera and I both present, not because she'd asked us to stay, but because it didn't seem to occur to her to want privacy for it. This was another thing I noticed. She didn't perform the things most people perform in the company of others. She just did what she was doing, and if you were there, you were there. When she finished, she folded it and set it on the table. "My sister's in Laramie," she said. "She married a man named Croft 2 years ago. She says I can come." Vera said, "That's good news." Nora nodded. She was still looking at the folded letter. I said, "Laramie's a good-sized town. Hard to put pressure on someone there without it going badly." She looked at me. "You know Laramie?" "Well enough." She was quiet for a moment. "Then how far?" I told her. 4 days on horseback, maybe 5, depending on weather and pace. She sat with that. "How far from Calderon?" she said. "Far enough," I said. She picked up the letter and held it in both hands, not rereading it, just holding it. "Far enough," she said. "I should tell you about the 4th night." Not the 4th day. The day was ordinary enough, Nora making arrangements, Vera helping her think through what she'd need for the road, the two of them at the kitchen table with Nora's traveling case open and the contents spread out, accounting for what was there and what wasn't. I handled some practicalities about the route: distance, weather, water, towns, where to stop and where to push through. The liveryman in Ray's Creek had a bay mare he'd sell fair, a steady animal, suitable for the road. I went and looked at the mare, bought her. Vera said, "You're going with her." It wasn't a question either. Vera had a gift for stating things. "Route's not simple," I said. "No," she said, "it's not." That was the whole conversation. The 4th night. I was sitting on the back step of Vera's house in the dark, sometime after 9. Not because I couldn't sleep. I'd learned to sleep anywhere a long time ago, and the skill hadn't left me. I was sitting there because something was happening in me that I wanted to be alone with for a while, the way you want to be alone with a thing when you don't know what to call it yet, and naming it too early might get it wrong. I heard the back door open. I knew her step by then. 4 days is enough if you're paying attention, and I had been paying attention more than I'd realized until that moment. She came and sat on the step beside me, not close enough to crowd, just present, accounted for. We sat there for a while without saying anything. The creek was audible from here, a low sound, steady, the same creek we'd ridden along that afternoon. Something had changed in the air over the last few hours. There was a shift in it, that particular feeling before weather moves in from the west. She said, "You're going to take me to Laramie." It wasn't a question. "I was thinking about it," I said. "You've been thinking about a lot of things for 4 days," she said. There was something dry in it, not unkind. Like she was teasing me from a position of understanding, from having watched the process and being patient enough to let it run. I looked at her. In the dark I could see the line of her profile against the lighter dark of the sky. "I've been out of the habit of deciding things for myself," I said. "I kept thinking somebody else was going to tell me what to do." "Nobody's going to tell you what to do," she said. "I know that now." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What happened the year that went wrong?" I looked out at the dark shape of the creek line. "How did you know about a year that went wrong?" I said. "Because you move like a man who's been somewhere and isn't sure he came all the way back," she said. "Not all the time. Sometimes you're entirely here, but sometimes there's something behind your face that's somewhere else." I sat with that for a while. It was an accurate thing to say, and it surprised me to hear it said, mostly because I hadn't expected to hear it from anyone. Most people either didn't notice or didn't say. I told her, not all of it, some things don't reduce to words without losing the specific gravity of them, the weight of them as lived events. But enough. The shooting in Blackwater and the boy behind the door, the woman in Harlow and the letter, the business in Ord County and the question the wife had asked. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't offer consolation or judgment. She didn't tell me I'd done the right things or the wrong things or that it would be all right. She just sat with what I'd said for a while, and that sitting was more respectful of it than any comfort would have been. Then she said, "You stopped for a trunk with a padlock on it." My horse stopped. "You stayed," she said, "when you could have gone." I thought I was going. "You didn't go." I looked at her, she was looking at me. "A man who'd gone all the way to wherever you were going," she said, "doesn't stop, doesn't cut a padlock, doesn't stand on a porch in the noon sun and give two hired men his name and his counties." She paused. "Whatever got lost in that year, you didn't lose all of it." I didn't say anything. She looked back out at the dark. "I'm not lost," she said. "I know it looked that way in the trunk. It wasn't. I'd been in that box and I knew I needed to get out of it and I was going to find a way, one way or another. You were just—" She stopped, started again. "You were the lid rising." The creek ran on in the dark. Something moved out in the grass, a small night animal going about its business without any interest in ours. I said, "You're not what I expected to find in there." "What did you expect?" "I wasn't thinking that far." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh but not quite. "Neither was I." We sat on that step for a long time, and neither of us filled the rest of the silence, and the silence was fine. We left for Laramie on the 5th morning. Vera had the food packed before we came down for breakfast. She was like that. She'd already decided what was needed, and she didn't wait for someone else to think of it. She'd packed enough for 5 or 6 days, more than we'd need if the weather held, because Vera's philosophy was that you pack for the weather you might get, not the weather you want. She embraced Nora at the gate for a longer time than I'd expected from Vera, who wasn't generally given to prolonged demonstrations. Then she said something into Nora's ear that I didn't catch, and Nora nodded. Then Vera looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked. Then she nodded once, the way you nod at something you've decided you're not worried about anymore. We rode north. The country between Rays Creek and Laramie is plain country, not boring but uncomplicated, the kind of land that asks nothing of you and gives you room to think. Rolling grass, long horizons, the mountains a blue suggestion far to the west. The sky above the plains has a scale to it that does something to you after a while if you let it. It makes your problems the right size. Not smaller than they are, just the right size, in proportion to everything else. She rode alongside me on the bay mare, who turned out to be as steady as advertised. Calhoun accepted the company without complaint. The two horses found a rhythm with each other inside the first mile. The first day we covered good ground, 15 miles or more, on roads that were reasonable and in weather that cooperated. We stopped at noon to water the horses and eat some of what Vera had packed, sitting in the grass by a low stream. After, she didn't rush to remount. She sat a while longer looking at the water. "Tell me about Laramie," she said. I told her what I knew. The railroad had come through 12 years prior and the town had grown up fast around it and then settled into itself. Not a boom town anymore, a real town, with permanence in it and the kind of variety that comes when enough different kinds of people have decided to stay. She asked about work, about what a woman could find there without a husband's name behind her. I told her about the businesses I'd seen, the kinds of things that were needed, the ways a capable and determined woman could build a life. She listened carefully. She had a way of listening that was active. You could see her filing things, organizing them, thinking about what they meant for her specific situation. Not passive reception, active use. She asked practical questions. What were the streets like? What did things cost? Was it a place that would leave a woman alone to make her own way, or would it be curious and intrusive about a woman without obvious circumstances? I told her honestly, some of both, but enough of the first kind to make it workable. She nodded. "I can work with some of both," she said. She could, I already knew that. The second day the weather moved in, not hard rain, just the kind of persistent drizzle that gets into everything, that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and works its way in and settles there. We rode through it without complaint. She didn't suggest stopping, and I didn't either. By mid-afternoon we were both wet through, the horses content, the road empty in all directions. At some point she started talking about her mother. I hadn't known there was a mother to speak of. She'd only mentioned her father. The mother had died when Nora was 12. She described her with the specific precision of a person who memorized someone before they had to, knowing what was coming. A woman who could read the weather and read a room, and who had strong opinions about both and wasn't shy about sharing them. A woman who had worked hard and expected work from the people around her and didn't apologize for either. She would have hated this, Nora said. The drizzle was soft on the brim of her hat. The trunk, all of it, she would have been furious. At you, I said. At my father, at Greaves, at the situation. A pause. At me a little probably for not getting out sooner. How do you get out sooner when they lock the lid? She was quiet for a moment in the rain. You don't let them lock it, she said. That's what she would have said. Another pause. She wouldn't have been wrong, but she also wouldn't have been in my position. She never let anything get that far. I looked at her sideways in the rain. Her profile was steady under the hat, looking ahead at the road. You're out now, I said. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, gratitude, but not the soft kind, not the kind that diminishes you or puts you above the person feeling it. The kind between equals. The kind that acknowledges a real thing without making you responsible for it. I am, she said. We rode on through the rain. The mountains were invisible to the west. The road ahead was visible about a quarter-mile, and that was all, and it was enough. That second night we found shelter at a way station, a traveler's stop that had been built for the road traffic before the railroad came and had stayed on, reduced in purpose but still useful for exactly the situation we were in. 2 people wet to the bone who needed a roof and a fire. The man who ran it was elderly, incurious, and charged a fair price without comment. He had a dog who assessed us both thoroughly and then decided we were fine and went back to his spot by the fire. We dried out, ate from Vera's pack, spread our bedrolls on opposite sides of the main room's fire, and were asleep at a decent hour. I woke once in the night. The fire had burned down and the room was dim and cold at the edges, and the rain was still going outside, steady on the roof. The kind of sound that's either restless or peaceful depending on where you are when you hear it. I lay and listened to it for a while. Somewhere in the months between Blackwater and that moment, the rain on a roof had started to sound restless to me. Not because the rain had changed, because I had, or because whatever had changed in me made everything sound like something I needed to account for, needed to be watchful of. The constant low vigilance of a man who's lost his bearings. You stop trusting quiet. You stop trusting stillness. You treat them like they're hiding something. The rain on that way station roof sounded like rain. That was new. That was the clearest sign, yet that something was changing. I went back to sleep. The third day was clear and cold, the kind of blue sky cold that follows rain through plains country, with the air so clean it almost hurt your lungs at first. The mountains came back into view on the west, white-topped now from snow that had fallen overnight above the timberline, the whole range visible in the clean air, closer looking than it was. She rode looking at them for a long time. Have you ever been up in them? She said. Once, I said, one winter tracking a man. And I found him and came down and haven't been back. She was quiet for a while. I'd like to go up in them someday, she said, not for any particular reason. Just to know what's up there. There's a lot of nothing, I said, and then a view. That sounds about right, she said. We rode on. The trail was good after the rain, the ground firm but not hard, and the horses were easy in the cold air and moving well. It was one of those mornings that feel like a gift from the country, when everything is exactly as sharp as it's supposed to be, and the distance is clear in every direction, and you can see the shape of the world you're moving through. The third night. We made camp at a spot I'd used before, a slight rise east of the trail, sheltered on the north by an old boulder fall, with a fire ring somebody had built years back and kept up ever since. The kind of camp that's been used, and will keep being used, because it's the right place at the right distance on the road. I had a fire going before the dark came full on. The rain from the second day had left the wood damp on the surface, but there was dry wood underneath the fallen timber at the edge of the boulder fall, and I took the time to find it. There's a specific satisfaction in that too, the finding of dry wood in wet country, the skill involved, the small victory of fire. She sat across from me, boots set close to the fire to dry out the day's cold. She'd had her boots off and been holding her feet toward the heat, and now she had them back on and was sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, looking at the fire. "What happens after Laramie?" she said. "How do you mean?" "After you get me there," she looked up, "what are you going to do?" I'd been thinking about that, in and out, for 3 days. Thinking about it and also not quite thinking about it, which is the way you approach a question when you're not ready for the answer you might get. "I don't know yet," I said. "There's a job." There's always a job if you go looking. Whether it's a job worth doing is a different question. She was quiet for a moment. The fire between us cracked and settled. An ember fell and went dark on the ground. "Is that what happened?" she said. "The year that went wrong, you stopped being able to tell whether it was worth doing." I thought about that. "Something like that," I said. "More like I stopped being able to feel it. I still knew. I just couldn't feel the knowing." She nodded slowly, like that was something she recognized from a different direction. "I think that happened to me with my father," she said. "I still knew he was wrong. I just stopped being able to." She made a small gesture with one hand, like something slipping away through the fingers. "Act on it." "The trunk," I said. "The trunk," she agreed. I'd been in it for months in a way, before Rudd actually locked the lid. I thought about that. "What changed?" I said. "What made you get into it and hold the lid down?" She looked at the fire. "I ran the arithmetic," she said. "I figured out what was on the other side of this road if I didn't stop it, and the thing that was on the other side was worse than whatever was inside the box." She paused. I was scared, but being scared was better than not having tried. I sat with that. "That's not nothing," I said. "No," she said, "it isn't." She looked at me across the fire. "What's on the other side of Laramie for you, if you just keep going west?" I looked at the fire. "More of the same," I said. "More jobs, more moving, more." I stopped. "More empty," she said. I looked at her. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do," she said quickly. "I mean it. I'm just saying what I can see." "I know," I said, "and you're not wrong." She looked back at the fire. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that still had some pale in it from the gone-down sun, out on the western edge. "You said you stopped being able to feel the knowing," she said. "Has it come back?" "Any of it?" I thought about the porch in the noon sun, about the padlock hinge coming out of the wood, about the way it had felt, the clarity of it. "Some of it," I said. "When?" I looked at her across the fire. "You know when," I said. She held my eyes for a moment, then she looked back at the fire. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." We sat in the firelight. I banked it down before too long. No point wasting good wood on a night that was cold but not dangerous. We put our bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire ring, the sensible arrangement. But I lay awake for a while looking at the stars, which were thick that night and very clear in the washed clean air after 2 days of weather. The particular density of stars over open country that you can't get anywhere near a town, where the lights drown them. Out here they were everything. The whole dark dome of the sky salted with them, the river of them running north to south, the particular ones I'd learned as a young man and hadn't ever forgotten. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been aware of anything for a year or more, of being exactly where I was. Not somewhere else in my head, not back in Blackwater or Harlow or Ord County. Here, on this rise under these stars, with this fire banking down and this woman sleeping on the other side of it. Present. That's the word for it, I think. Not fixed or healed or resolved, just present, just here. It had been a long time. We came into Laramie on the afternoon of the fourth day. The town was busy in the way railroad towns are busy, not frantic but purposeful, people moving on their errands, wagons on the main street, the sound of the rail yard underneath everything like a constant low note. She looked at it with that reading look she had, the look that takes inventory. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Is that all right?" She looked around at the street, at the buildings, at the people passing. "I think so," she said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, it's all right." We found her sister's address without difficulty. A woman at the hardware store gave us directions without making any particular story about two people arriving together on horseback, which told me something good about the town. Nora's sister lived in a well-kept house on a street 2 blocks east of Maine, a house with a garden out front that was doing well even in the dry season, which meant someone was tending it carefully. I held the horses while she went to the door. I watched her knock. The door opened after a moment, and a woman appeared who was not Nora's twin but was clearly her sister, same height, same way of holding herself, a different coloring but something in the structure of the face, the set of it. For a moment they just stood and looked at each other, the two of them. Then the sister opened her arms and Nora went in, and the embrace lasted a good while. The sister looked over Nora's shoulder at me. I touched my hat. She gave me a long, considering look, the kind that decides something, and then she nodded, once. The nod of a woman who has already been told something by the way her sister walked up to that door. I unsaddled both horses at the livery and arranged for their board. The livery man was a taciturn person who communicated mainly through grunts and who looked at the bay mare with the particular eye of a man who knows good horses and sees one. He said she'd be fine, which I took as high praise. When I came back, the sister, her name was Pauline, and she was a capable-looking woman with clear eyes and flour on her apron, had put out coffee and something to eat, and the three of us sat in her kitchen, and I told the short version of the last 5 days. Pauline listened without interrupting. She had the same quality of active listening that Nora had, which made me think it came from somewhere they'd both been formed by, their mother, maybe, or the particular set of years that had shaped them both. She sat straight and had her hands flat on the table, and you could see her organizing what I was telling her into the picture she was building of the situation. When I was done, she said, "You brought her here." "She got herself here," I said. "I just rode the same direction." Pauline looked at her sister. Nora was looking at her coffee, a small smile at the corner of her mouth. Pauline looked back at me. "Croft will want to meet you," she said. Her husband was out of town for 2 more days on business, she'd told us. "He'll have questions." "That's fair," I said. "Don't worry," Nora said, without looking up from her coffee. "She means that in a good way." Pauline looked at her sister for a moment. "I might," she said. Then she looked back at me. "You can stay tonight. There's a room upstairs we don't use." I said I appreciated it and meant it. That evening Pauline made a proper meal, roasted chicken and potatoes and some kind of greens from the garden, and the 3 of us ate at a table large enough for 4, with the empty chair at one end that was Croft's. The kitchen was a good kitchen, the kind that has been cooked in seriously and shows it. Copper pots on the wall, a shelf of preserves that represented a year of work, a window over the basin that looked out on the garden. I ate and said little, and watched Nora's sister watch her sister. Pauline was careful and methodical in the way she looked after things. She refilled Nora's cup without being asked. She noticed when Nora reached for the bread and moved it closer. These were the small habitual kindnesses of someone who'd been paying attention to the people in her kitchen for a long time and had made a practice of it. At some point, after the plates were cleared and the coffee was on, Pauline said, "Father's going to hear about this." "I know," Nora said. "I've already written to him." "What did you say?" "That I was safe and I wasn't coming back to Calderon, and that I hoped he'd find a way to resolve the debt that didn't involve selling his daughters." A pause. "I said it more gently than that." Pauline looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Good." They looked at each other across the table in the way of sisters who have years of shorthand between them. Whole conversations that happen without words, because the words have already been said 100 times, and the shorthand is faster and more accurate. Then Pauline looked at me. "Thank you," she said, "for doing what you did." I said it needed doing. "Yes," she said, "but not everyone who could have done it would have." I didn't have an answer to that, so I drank my coffee. "You can stay tonight," she said again, and this time it had more in it, something about longer than tonight being possible if it came to that. She was a precise woman who chose her words carefully, and I heard what she was doing with them. After supper, Nora found me on the porch. It was evening, the last of the light going off the mountains to the west, the street beginning to quiet itself down, the particular early evening quiet of a town where people have done their day's work and are settling toward the night. She came out and stood beside me at the rail, and we looked at the mountains together for a while. She said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly." "All right," I said. "You did something for me that I can't pay back," she said. "Not because I don't want to, but because the things that matter most don't work that way. You can't put them on an account." I looked at her. She was looking at the mountains. "You cut a padlock," she said. "You stood on a porch in the sun and gave your name. You rode through 4 days of road and rain." She paused. "You told me the truth about yourself at a fire when you didn't have to, and you didn't dress it up, and you didn't make it smaller than it was or larger, just what it was." "You asked," I said. "People ask things they don't really want answered all the time. They ask because they want to seem like the kind of person who asks." She turned and looked at me. "You gave me the real answer." I held her gaze. The evening light was going soft and gold on the mountains. She said, "I'm not saying this to return a favor. I'm saying it because it's true, and I want you to know that I know it's true." A pause. "You came back from wherever you'd been. Watching you these last days, you came back. I could see it. You should know that." I didn't say anything for a moment. "I noticed some things too," I said. She looked at me steadily. "What things?" "That you're not what I expected," I said. "That you read country the way I do. That you don't perform yourself for anybody, which is rarer than it should be." I looked at the mountains. "That when you said I didn't have to stay, you meant it, and that made me want to stay." She was quiet for a moment. The light on the mountains was something, that last-minute light before it goes entirely, turning the stone a color that doesn't have an ordinary name. "Are you going to leave now?" she said. I thought about it. "No," I said. She nodded just once. But there was something in that nod that went deep, relief, maybe, but not the desperate kind, not the kind that puts a weight on you. The kind that comes when the thing you hoped was true turns out to be true after all. "Good," she said. She reached out and put her hand over mine where it was resting on the porch rail. She didn't make anything of it, just put it there, warm and steady and deliberate. I turned my hand over and held hers. The mountains went to dark blue. The last of the light left them, and they became their shapes against the sky. We stood there. "I'm going to tell you how it ended up, because you've been patient enough to ride the whole distance with me, and a man who asks you to ride that far owes you the destination. I stayed in Laramie. Not out of inertia. Not because I had nowhere else to go, though it's true I didn't, exactly, but that wasn't the reason. I stayed because for the first time in a year something felt located. Somewhere specific in the world that was the right place to be, for reasons I could account for. That's not nothing, for a man who'd been moving without direction for 8 months. Croft came back from his business trip 2 days after we arrived. He was a fair-sized man, methodical and careful, with the quality of someone who's built something real and knows its worth and isn't going to be pushed off it. He sat across from me at Pauline's kitchen table and asked direct questions and listened to the answers without interrupting, and at the end he said, "I know Marshall Hennessy. I'll put a word in." I said I appreciated it. He said, "Don't thank me yet. He's particular about who he works with." Marshall Hennessy turned out to be a small man in his 50s with eyebrows that had opinions of their own, and a way of looking at you that gave you the impression he'd already come to several conclusions before you'd finished your first sentence. He asked me about Blackwater and Dunmore and Harlow and Ord County in a way that made clear he'd already checked what he could check, and was now seeing whether my account matched the record. It did, because it was true. He said, "You left Ord County under some kind of cloud." "No cloud," I said. "I left because the job was done and I was done with jobs for a while." "That's not exactly how I heard it." "How did you hear it?" He told me. It was a version of what had happened, accurate on the surface facts, wrong about the interior of it, the way things get when they travel. I told him the interior of it, plain, without defense and without elaboration, the woman in the doorway, the question she'd asked, what I'd done afterward. Hennessy listened with those eyebrows in motion. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What was the question?" he said. "The one she asked." I told him. He sat for a while longer. Then he said, "All right, here's what I have." The consulting arrangement was real work. 3 days a week to start, more when it was needed. Laramie had grown faster than its institutions had, which meant there were gaps in things that needed careful people with experience to fill them without making a public situation out of it. I was suited to that. I'd spent my career in the gaps. It suited me. I won't say I'd found my calling, that language is too large for what it actually was. I'd found work that was worth doing and felt true. That's a great deal, in fact, more than a lot of people find. In the evenings, the first weeks, I ate at a boarding house near the marshal's office and walked the town. Laramie at that time was in the middle of becoming itself, still some of the rawness of the early railroad years, but the permanence was setting in. You could see it in the buildings going up in brick where they'd been in wood before, in the schools and the churches that get built when people have decided they're staying, in the particular business of a town that has decided it has a future. I walked it the way I walk any new place I'm thinking about, not as a sightseer but as a reader, reading the blocks, reading the hours, reading the kind of trouble each corner had seen or was likely to see. After 3 weeks I had a good map of it in my head, not the street grid, which any man could carry after a day or two, but the human geography of it, where the pressure points were, where things were likely to go sideways and in what direction. Hennessy noticed. He said, "You've been making rounds." "Habit," I said. "Good habit," he said. "What did you find?" I told him. He listened and took 2 notes and didn't seem surprised by any of it, which meant he already knew and had been curious to see how long it would take me to get there. Nora took a position as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant on Main Street, whose previous bookkeeper had absconded with 6 months of accounts and a not insignificant amount of actual money. The merchant's name was Aldrich, and he was nervous in the way of men who have been made a fool of and are afraid it will happen again, not a bad man, just a chastened one. She was methodical and unsentimental about numbers, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. Within 2 months, she had the accounts untangled and the reconciliation done, and the difference between what should have been there and what was there was documented thoroughly enough that Aldrich had a solid case if he chose to pursue it. He paid her fairly, which she'd made clear was a condition of the arrangement before she agreed to it. He tried to argue and she'd let him try, and then stated her terms again and he'd agreed, because he'd looked at what she'd done to his books in 2 months, and he was not a stupid man. She told me this matter-of-factly over supper at Pauline's one evening, as though the negotiation had been a minor technical matter, and not a woman in a new town, insisting on being paid what she was worth. I thought about that for a while after. She lived at Pauline's for the first year, not because she couldn't have found her own place sooner, but because Pauline's was good and there was no particular urgency, and she was, I could see it in those months, doing the thing she described in the wagon, being somewhere she could think, taking her time, making decisions at the pace they deserved rather than the pace that fear imposes. Then she found a small house on a quiet street, 2 rooms, a yard that had possibilities, a front door that locked well and had no trunk involved in the arrangement. She moved into it on a Thursday in October and was clearly satisfied with the independence of it in a way that went deeper than just having her own space. I helped her move in. It took most of an afternoon. We moved the furniture from Pauline's spare room, a bed and a dresser and a small table and 2 chairs, and arranged it in the new house, and then stood in the main room looking at it. She put her hands on her hips and looked around. "It's not much," she said, not complaining, just stating the fact. "No," I said. "It's mine, though." "It is," I said. She looked at me, something in her face that I'd been watching change over the months, something that had been careful and held back and was slowly, steadily, becoming something else, something like ease, like a person arriving at the place they were always going to end up and not being surprised it feels right. "Thank you for helping," she said. "Any time," I said, and meant it. And she knew I meant it, which was the part that mattered. Greaves sent 1 letter. I wrote the reply myself, and I won't repeat it here except to say that it referenced 4 different laws in 2 territories, used the word prosecution twice and the word personally once, and was signed with my name and the names of the counties. Hennessy co-signed it, which added a layer that made the legal weight of it unambiguous. We didn't hear from Greaves again. Her father was a longer problem. Long problems usually are, they involve more people, more history, more of the particular difficulty of family, which is that the people who hurt you are the same people you remember loving, and the love doesn't stop just because the hurt was real. He wrote several letters over the first 6 months, which she answered briefly and without rancor. Not reconciliation. Contact. The beginning of the possibility of something, held at arm's length while she decided what she wanted that something to eventually be. She showed me one of his letters once, without asking me to read it. Just set it on the table between us one evening and looked at it. The handwriting was careful, the writing of a man who'd learned it late and was precise because precision was how he showed respect. He wrote about the ranch, about the drought breaking finally in the fall, how the creek had come back, how the grass was returning. He wrote that he'd spoken to Greaves. He didn't say what had been said, but the way he wrote about it made clear that some accounting had been rendered, some part of the debt resolved. He wrote, "I understand if you cannot forgive me. I would not blame you, but I want you to know that I understand now what I failed to understand then." She looked at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in her case and didn't say anything about it, and I didn't ask. 3 weeks later she wrote him back. I knew because she asked me for a sheet of paper. The summer after we arrived in Laramie, he rode up one afternoon on a horse that had seen better days and was wearing a good hat and a shirt that had been pressed, which told you something about the state of mind in which he'd made the journey. He came to Pauline's and Pauline let him in, and they sat in the kitchen while Nora and Pauline were both present, and I could hear from the front room where I'd stationed myself that it started formally and carefully, and then, at some point, got quieter and slower, the way conversations get when the formal version has been dispensed with and the real one has begun. I sat on the porch for a long time. The afternoon was warm and the street outside Pauline's was doing its ordinary business, which was the business of a town on a Tuesday: deliveries, conversations, a dog working its way down the opposite sidewalk with great purpose and no evident destination. At some point, Nora came out and stood beside me. "He wants to meet you," she said. I figured. Don't be too hard on him. I wasn't planning to be. She looked at me. I know, I was saying it more for my own benefit. I nearly smiled at that. There was something in the way she said it, the self-awareness of it, the lightness, that told me she'd come further in the months since the trunk than she probably knew. We went inside. The man I met was not the villain I might have made him into if I'd only had the trunk and the padlock and the two men on fresh horses to go by. He was a tired rancher in his late 50s, sunburned and thinner than he probably had been, with hands that told 20 years of hard work and eyes that told a harder year or two on top of it. He looked at me the way a man looks at another man when he knows he owes that man something and isn't sure what the proper amount is. I knew something about how the arithmetic of a situation can look different from inside it when you're scared and running short, about the decisions you make in that state and how they follow you. I'd made some of my own. "Mr. Holt," he said. "Mr. Voss," I said. We shook hands. His grip was what I expected, honest and a little too careful, the grip of a man who wants to communicate something and isn't sure his hands know how. We sat at Pauline's kitchen table, all four of us. Pauline had made coffee and then made herself busy at the counter in a way that made clear she was staying present without imposing. And he asked me questions and I answered them plainly. And at some point the conversation shifted and became, for a few minutes, something closer to honest. He said, "I want you to know that I know what I did wrong." I said, "All right. I want you to know that it won't happen again, that I understand." I looked at him. He was looking at his hands around his coffee cup. "I believe you," I said, and I did, which surprised me a little. You develop a sense over the years for the difference between a man who is sorry because he got caught and a man who is sorry because he's genuinely arrived somewhere new. He was the second kind, slowly and painfully and at some cost, but genuinely. We didn't become friends. I didn't expect us to. But we shook hands honestly at the door when he left, which is where most things have to start, and Nora walked him to his horse and stood there for a while after he rode out, looking south down the street. Then she came back in. She didn't say anything about it. She sat down at Pauline's table and had what was left of her coffee, and after a while Pauline said something that made her laugh, and she laughed, and that was the end of the afternoon. I want to say one more thing about what she said on the porch in Laramie, the thing about coming back from wherever I'd been. I've thought about it a great deal since then, about what she saw that she was able to name it so accurately, about what it means to come back. I don't think it was the padlock, or the porch, or the 4 days ride. Those things were all just the shape of it, the visible outside of something that had been happening before I could see it, the way a river's path is visible from the surface, but the current that made it runs deep below. I think the coming back started when I heard breathing in a locked trunk, and something in me recognized it. Not as a woman in trouble, not as a problem to be solved, as something worth pulling toward the light. I've thought about that too, about what it means that the thing that reached me after everything, not the work, not the responsibility, not any of the practical reasons I'd given myself for continuing, was just the sound of someone still breathing in the dark, still going, still there. I don't know if that's what hope sounds like when it's almost gone, when it's very quiet and in the dark and no longer calling for anyone. I think maybe it is. I think maybe it sounds like breathing, careful and slow and still going in the dark, not giving up, not performing bravery, just continuing because continuing is what living things do until they can't. She'd been in that trunk through a long night and most of a day and she had given up on being found. She told me that later, not with self-pity but with the same plain accuracy she applied to everything. She'd said, I'd stopped expecting the lid to open. I'd started working on what came next after that. She'd meant it. She'd been making a plan in there in the dark and the heat and the silence for a version of the future that didn't involve rescue, because the plan was what she had. That's who she was. And the coming back for me, or whatever it is that happens when a year of empty starts to fill again, started in the moment I put my ear to that trunk and heard it. Because you don't do that if the part of you that gives a damn has gone away entirely. You ride past. You tell yourself it's not your business, and it probably isn't, and the horse will follow your lead if you make the decision fast enough. The part of me that gives a damn wasn't gone. It was just very quiet for a while, waiting for something it recognized. She heard it before I did. From inside the box she heard it. That's what I mean when I say she saved me. Not dramatically. Not in the way the word usually gets used, with someone pulling someone else back from a cliff edge with both hands and a great effort of will. She didn't know what she was doing to me by being in that trunk. She was just surviving, which is what she did, what she'd always done. But a man who's been going through the motions for a year, going through them well, going through them competently, but going through them without the thing that makes them mean something, that man doesn't cut a padlock and stand on a porch and ride 4 days in the rain for no reason. He does those things because something in him woke up, because the part of him that had gone quiet found something it recognized and said, yes, that's what we're for. She found that part. She didn't know she was finding it, but she did. She just did it from inside the box. There's a porch on the house we rent now, on the east side of Laramie. It faces west, which puts the mountains in front of you in the evening when you sit there. We built it, actually, added it to the side of the house the second winter, when the house itself had been made right and the next project was visible. Croft helped, and a neighbor whose name is Garfield and who knows more about carpentry than any of us. It took 3 Saturdays and came out solid. We sit there most nights when the weather allows, her with coffee and me with mine, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The mountains doing what mountains do, which is stand there and mean something without saying what. You have to make of it what you will. Some nights I make of it one thing and some nights another, and some nights I don't try to make anything of it and just look. That's something I couldn't do a year before I found the trunk. Just sit and look at something without the inside of my head running through its inventory of unfinished business. The sitting is simple, and it took me a long time to get back to it. I'm 56 years old, not young, not finished. My boots are resoled and were worth resoling. My hat is the same one I've had for 8 years, which is the right hat. Calhoun is in good grass at Pauline's, in a paddock Croft built to proper specifications, and he is content in the way of horses who are well fed and well kept, and occasionally ridden by someone who knows what she's doing. He watches her from the paddock when she comes to see him with the same particular calm dignity he's always had, as though he made a decision about her some time ago and has had no cause to revise it. She turned 31 last month. We had supper at Pauline's, the whole family, and Croft told a long story about a mule and a telegraph wire that went badly in several directions at once, and which got funnier with each detail added, the way only true stories get. Made everyone laugh, including me. Made Nora laugh until she had to put her fork down, which is a sight worth working toward. Pauline's eldest has started riding and shows every sign of being genuinely good at it, the easy, unconscious good. The kind that's born in and not taught. That means she'll be better than all of us inside of 3 years. After supper on the walk home, Nora took my arm. She does that on the walk home from Pauline's. Not every time, but often enough that I notice when she does, and I notice when she doesn't, and both ways of noticing are good. The night was clear and cold, and the street was quiet, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky that still had some deep blue in it above the black. She said good night. I said good night. Not meaning the end of the evening, meaning the kind of night it was, She knew what I meant. She looked up at the same sky and said it again, softer. The kind of good night that's about something larger than the particular evening. I know what I am in the look she has for me across a table, across a fire, across the particular width of Pauline's kitchen. I've known it for a while now, and knowing it is something I carry the way you carry a thing that has real weight, not a burden, the good kind of weight, the kind that tells you something true is there. I don't take it for granted. A man who's been where I was for a year knows well enough not to take something like that for granted. You come out the other side of a year like that knowing the difference between when things are there and when they aren't, and you don't make the mistake of assuming the presence of good things is permanent or automatic or owed to you. I was worth finding in that trunk as much as she was. She'd say I've got it backwards, that I'm the one who found her, that she was the one in the box, that I cut the padlock and lifted the lid, which is true. But I know what I know. I know what was in me before that afternoon on those flats and what was in me after, and what changed between the two. She found me first. She just did it from inside the box.